these guys were burglarizing homes all throughout Watertown here and throughout the county. And it seemed like they had it in because there was yet another mysterious woman who is known to perhaps to be a woman of the night who ran some type of cleaning service, like a maid service. Is that correct?
Yeah, we have Bertha Belcher who would do house cleaning, and then she'd come back, and so apparently she was telling her associates where to go, what to find, and she was sort of a kingpin in this whole burglary operation, and that's Bertha Belcher. And Bertha, she was a mademoiselle in Watertown. She was quite well known, Ma Belcher, I think they called her.
Yep. And she was married to?
Her husband was about 20 years her junior, and that would be Willard Belcher.
And Willard Belcher, of course, was also implicated as being one of the shooters in this triple murder.
He was implicated but never charged.
Never charged. And of course, Mr. Pickett was also the other guy that could have been, again, we're talking about two guns used in this because, like we noted earlier, Peter and his brother Gerald was shot with the same pistol that night in the Mercury, yet another caliber pistol, a .38 if I'm not mistaken, was used to kill Barbara Egan.
Right.
Who perhaps, it is alleged, saw that her husband Peter was shot and then his brother Gerald was shot, and at that point she obviously saw the opportunity to get out of the vehicle, and then she literally ran, I guess, tried to run across Route 81, which has just been built, and it is alleged that one of the shooters got out of the vehicle, got to her, and actually dragged her by her hair.
Yeah, she was still in her hair curlers because she was hoping to go out New Year's Eve over at Watertown Bowl. Some of those curlers were found at the murder scene, so it appears that she was indeed dragged by her hair back to the car, and her body was found alongside the passenger side of the car.
The Jays discovered the bodies at 9:30.
About 9:30, there, around that time at least, that's when the bodies are discovered.
Correct.
Let's talk about Barbara. You know, in the book, it shows that one, she was a smart, intelligent girl from South Jefferson, did very well in school, very attractive, had almost married a very respectable guy prior to meeting Peter. But one infamous night, I guess, she meets him at a YMCA dance. And at that point, that's when she, somehow or other, just like Betty Boop, if you will, she really falls in love with this truly bad boy. And why is that? Does anyone know why a young woman like that, who obviously had a good outlook on her life, decides to get associated with this guy?
From what we've been told, she was already into doing some shoplifting with one of her classmates. And so I think she was destined for a wild life. So, yeah, she gets introduced to this guy, Peter Egan, at this dance, and her classmates say she was just attracted to the bad guys.
And that's ultimately what led to her death because, you know, she's associated with a bad guy who's grown up that way. But like you said, Dave, she had that inclination to be a bad person even prior to even meeting Peter.
Yeah, she was sneaking out and using a friend as an alibi, so the friend would have to lie to her parents about where she was. That's probably somewhat typical of teenagers these days, however. We do find indication that she was unhappy with this life eventually, and she would tell people that she really wanted to get out of that arrangement, but she did get out of it, unfortunately, fatally.
It's interesting, we're sitting right here on Lower Court Street, and Peter was in and out of jail for all types of actions or criminal activity, one of which I believe was he got a drunk driving conviction. And it wasn't uncommon to see Barbara actually speak to Peter right on the street level as he was in his jail cell. So that just adds more to this area right here. This was the place they hung out. The Rotary gas station was apparently their hangout because there was, you know, back then they had pinball machines inside gas stations. And then across the way was the restaurant and the bar. So this Lower Court Street was pretty active for these guys.
Yeah, ground zero for the Egans.
The 31st, however, you know, they're told that there's going to be some type of truck to be hijacked. All three of them get into her car, the Mercury station wagon, because it is alleged, because of the casings, there's two shooters in the back seat. And then on top of that, there's a dog in the car. Whose dog was that?
Queenie, that's Barbara's dog, little fella, and and so he's believed to be the only living witness to the shootings.
So Jay, the fellow coming up from Rochester, sees that there's a dog in there. He's barking up a storm. He's got blood on him because he's on the shoulders of one of the deceased.
Yeah.
There's probably blood all over the place from the shots, and you're not going to get much testimony from a dog. And that said, unfortunately, little Queenie apparently was inherited by someone else that week, and only 2 weeks later was killed and run over by a vehicle.
That's true. And I suppose, if Queenie had survived, maybe if they brought a suspect in front of the dog, maybe they'd hoped to get some kind of violent reaction from the dog. But that didn't materialize, obviously.
If two men are in the back seat of the Mercury and they shoot the two brothers in the front seat, and then one gets out of the car, it is alleged, and kills Barbara Egan in the middle of the road and drags her back, the car is still left there with all three bodies, one outside the vehicle, two inside the vehicle. How did the triggermen themselves leave the rest stop? Because there's no residents near there and get away with it. No footprints. There was no snow that night either to indicate there was a second car. How do you think, Dan, they got out of there?
James Pickett, one of the conspirators, told me that Joe Leone and Willard Belcher rode down to the rest area that night in Joe's girlfriend's car.
What car did they manage to get back in and get out of that location?
Yes, that would have been Beth Johnson's 1962 Comet. Pickett told me that his job was to take Barbara away from the rest area. He told me that she drove away in Beth Johnson's car and returned. And upon returning to the rest area, she discovered dead bodies of her husband and brother-in-law, possibly even heard the shots go off. She started to run, and that's when Joe Leone fired 3 shots at her through the windshield with a .38. Missed her. Chased her down, caught her, stomped her, shot her, dragged her back behind the car.
Looks like they got away with it because they didn't leave much evidence. Of course, no DNA back then. It seems like they committed the perfect crime.
Right. No fingerprints were found at the scene. The Egans stopped and bought 2 pair of gloves at 7:30 on Bradley Street. When the police found the bodies, only 1 pair of gloves was found. So the police theorized if they could locate the other pair of gloves, they could find out who killed them.
A lot of police officers at the scene. They were all taken from various parties. Again, it's New Year's Eve, and it is at any time do they think they know, even despite the fact that they're doing roadblocks up near the bridge and some areas of the county. Is there any indication that they might have known who would have done this right away?
Within 2 days, or even less than 2 days, the police were questioning the very people who eventually became suspects in the case. They were very quickly pointed to a burglary ring, and they were ruling out all the other possibilities like narcotics, trafficking, gambling, prostitution. But they had a good start in the investigation, but they were having issues about developing any evidence that would bring about an immediate arrest.
Peter was a big spender. I believe earlier that day, he went right over to West Main Street, which is a stone's throw away from where we are right now, and made a purchase of over $200 in merchandise, which, again, back in 1964 is a lot of stuff. So although they weren't working, and they were on social services, it seemed like they had a lot of money.
Well, Barbara was into the prostitution angle. Pete would take her up to Camp Drum every payday. Soldiers would line up and have their way.
And you talk about a lot of money. Well, they were on welfare for a while, but the welfare was cut off because the government found out that they were like Peter was lending a lot of money out, and he was flashing at the bars, and actually Barbara complained one time that he had loaned out so many $1,000s and wasn't getting it back.
How can a guy like that, who was so mean and would actually use his wife or pimp his wife out to complete strangers, actually lend out money and not actively get it back like a thug that he apparently was? In other words, if he's a loan shark guy, wouldn't he demand the money to be back with a lot of interest?
That's a reasonable question. We don't have an answer.
So he was kind of a fickle guy. And getting back to the crime scene, a lot of people can't understand how he's in the front seat allowing someone to sit behind him because he knew that his life was in danger. But I guess because he knew Joe Leone and he knew Pickett, that he felt comfortable that night, right, Dan? Right, Dave?
He had to have trusted who was in the back seat, because he was conscious about having people behind him. Of course, he thought that they were going to hijack a truck. Although, when he was playing a machine there in the gas station.
Yeah, the same day.
Yeah, that evening he made some comment about this may be my last night.
And Joe Leone's in the gas station at the same time.
Yes, he is.
So doesn't he know that it's Joe that perhaps might be the trigger man that would take his life that night?
Well, I think he's worried about this guy Ganaski. Joe Ganaski was he was a military veteran, retired, and like we said, his place had been ripped off, burglary, and he supposedly put out the word that if his money isn't returned to him by the end of the year, Peter's a dead man.
So let's maybe put two pieces together here. The Leone family, Joe's family, is robbed on December 20th, 1964. A family heirloom and a lot of cash. And plus, Joe Leone knows the Egans and he feels betrayed by this. Then Ganowski probably approaches Joe and says, hey, he stole money from me too. So I give you money to set up some type of scheme to get these guys in a situation where you can take them out without anyone knowing it. Is that a good allegation?
It's certainly plausible.
Let's go back to January 1st. Again, they come back to their favorite stomping ground. The name of this restaurant again, Dan?
Red Moon Diner.
Red Moon Diner. They might have sat right in this very booth. Mr. Pickett, and Mr. Leone, and Pickett says later that he talked to Mr. Leone and said, did you hear about the murders last night? And Joe Leone said...
Right, Joe said no, that was the first he heard. Joe was having coffee with his girlfriend, Beth Johnson. Joe acted like he'd never heard it. That was the first he heard of it.
Joe is an imposing guy because it is stated in the book that he's like the leader of the gang.
Joe was a very popular person as a kid. His father was Kid Sullivan, famous boxer in Watertown. So everybody wanted to be Joe Leone's friends. That's how James Pickett met him, through his father's boxing circle.
And he was a famous boxer.
Yes, he was. He boxed extensively around the country, and toward the end of his career, he fought here in Watertown and even wrestled a bear.
And also, Joe was called the bread man, right?
Yeah, he drove the Wonder Bread truck.
And as a kid, you actually knew him, is that correct?
I did. Yep. He delivered the bread to Redwood, my hometown of Redwood. And every week he would give me a free box of donuts. It was expired stuff he took off the shelves in the store. That went on for about a year until he got arrested for triple murder.
Hey there! How you doing? I got stuff for you here. You ready? Are you? Hey, I got some cupcakes and I got some bread for you. Here you go. Okay.
And he testified in his defense, and some allege that he might not have, Mr. Pickett might not have had the right details on Mr. Leone's whereabouts on the 31st.
Pickett testified that Joe Leone told him right here that he murdered the Egans. This was a few days after January 1st, when Pickett claims Joe Leone acted like it was the first time he ever heard about the murders was the morning of January 1st when James Pickett told him right here in the Red Moon Diner.
Yeah, so it's the next day. Pickett actually meets up with Joe the next day after the murders. The entire county knows about this. Headlines across the country are essentially covering this major triple murder, which again, back in the early 60s, wasn't as common, unfortunately, as it is today. It's a little more than a year after JFK is assassinated. A lot of people look at that era as the end of innocence. Certainly, when you're living in Jefferson County, you realize that 3 residents are executed gangland style on a rest stop that's just been built. They must think that the world is coming to an end. It's like, wow, this is all of a sudden the world is a much more dangerous place. The next day, Pickett and Mr. Leone are in this diner on January 1st, 1965. Presents the question to him, hey, did you hear about the murders? But Joe Leone plays it at least that he didn't hear anything about it.
Correct.
It was news to him. He hadn't heard anything about it.
Even people who didn't even know the Egans knew something about it, and yet the next day he claims to not know anything
Joe
about it.
testified he stayed home that night. He went out to buy a pint of liquor and a pack of cigarettes and was home by 7:30.